So this is what we ended up with in the first video of this series, and if you instead stepped on this video by chance and you don't know what's going on, just take a look at part 1 and then come back here. Now that we have the base model of our Acanthus leaf, we are going to build the whole ring around the inner piece of our column. And since this is a pretty dense mesh already, we are going to use instances, but before doing that, we need to reorganize a bit our outline, since things are going to get a little bit more complex than this in a while. I started by renaming my main collection into Corinthian column, and then I created another collection and call it instances, and this is where I'm going to put all my instance generators. Within that, I created a sub-collection where to store my Acanthus leaf, and then I created another sub-collection, this time I call it controllers, and this is where I'm going to put all the empties and lattices that we are using in our modifier stack. During this process, I would suggest you to do yourself a favor and rename every item according to what it represents so that you can recognize it later on. In this particular case, I'm using SL for the Acanthus leaf, which stands for short leaf, just to tell it apart from the other version of the Acanthus leaf that we are going to create in a bit. With this reorganization out of the way, I'm going to select my Acanthus leaf and press Shift S and move cursor to selected. Then I'm going to press Shift A and add a plane and scale it down a bit in edit mode. And I'm going to place it in the same sub collection where my Acanthus leaf is. I will rename it as SL_plane. And I will then select my Acanthus leaf and then Ctrl left click my plane and then Ctrl P to make the plane the parent of the Acanthus leaf. With the plane still selected, under Object Properties and under Instancing, I'm going to select on Faces and disable the plane in both the viewport and the render. So this just means that on every face within this object, we're going to have an instance of our Acanthus leaf. So to take advantage of this, I'm going to add an empty, then select my plane and add an array modifier. And we will need to have 8 instances of our Acanthus leaf going all the way around this inner piece. So I'm going to type 8 here, deselect relative offset and select instead object offset, and finally select the empty that we just added. Please note that the empty is placed right at the origin point of both the Acanthus leaf and the plane, which is what we need. We can now move the cursor back to the center of the 3D world by pressing Shift C. And the center of the 3D world is also the center of our column, so this is going to work as intended. We can select our empty and switch the pivot point to the 3D cursor and start rotating on the Z axis. And you can see all the instances are coming along together. And right at the end, where you think the positioning is quite good, just take a look at the upper left corner where the rotation value is, because this is usually a defined value. In this case, we need to have a rotation of 45 degrees, so I can just type 45 and press enter. Let's rename the empty to something as SL_rotation, and I'm going to place it in my controller sub-collection. Going back to one of our references, we can see that we need to rotate the whole ring a bit on the Z-axis. In fact, on the reference, we see that we have 2 Acanthus leaves on the sides, and then we will have 1 Acanthus leaf right at the center, but this one belongs to the second ring. So in order to rotate them on the Z-axis, I'm going to select the plane and enable back the visibility, at least in the viewport, tab into edit mode and rotate it on the Z-axis by minus 22.5 degrees. And you can see that something is happening. Now we have 2 Acanthus leaves, and one is generated from the plane as an instance, and the other one is the original mesh that we modeled. So to avoid this, I'm going to expand here and uncheck the visibility of the original mesh, then select the plane and disable again its visibility in the viewport. And now we have something which is aligned to the reference that we are using. With that in place, I can select my SL ring sub-collection, right-click and instance to scene. I will then move this into my Corinthian column collection and disable the instances collection. And this will allow me to keep things a little bit more organized, since this is a single item in the outliner, and this will also allow me to move things all at once. I'm not losing any kind of information by doing so, since this SL ring instance still has a dynamic link with its generators. In fact, I can bring back one of my controllers, like the lattice, and I'm going to switch this back to median and this to local. And I can still tab into edit mode and do whatever manipulation I need, like bring everything down or rotate on a bit on the y-axis, move a bit on the x-axis, as you can see, without any loss of information. We can now move on to the second ring of leaves, and to do so I'm going to reuse a lot of what we did so far. So I'm going to mute my sl_ring collection, and I'm going to bring back my instances, and in particular I'm going to select my sl ring subcollection, mute the plane, and just isolate my Acanthus leaf. I'm going to click on it and then Shift D to duplicate. And we need to remove the parent-child relationship that it has with the SL plane. So I'm going to press Alt P and clear parent. I am now going to place it in its own subcollection. So I'm going to create a new collection and call it this time TL_ring, which stands for tall leaf. And I'm going to place my newly created Acanthus leaf in the new subcollection and rename it STL. And of course, we need also to duplicate the controllers because we want to manipulate the two leaves independently. So I'm going to select the deform and lattice and Shift D to duplicate. And then I'm going to rename them to TL deform and to TL lattice. And I'm also going to create a new subcollection because I want the controllers to be split into different subcollections. So I'm going to rename this to SL controllers, and this will contain only the controller belonging to the SL ring. And then I'm going to create a new one, and this time it will be TL controllers. And I'm going to select my TL deform and TL lattice, and I'm going to put them into this new subcollection. Lastly, but more importantly, I'm going to select my TL ring, and within the modifier stack, I'm going to link the correct item. So for the simple deform, it will be the TL deform, and for the lattice, it will be the TL lattice. It is now time to start working on the appearance of our TL leaf. So I'm going to bring back one of my references, like this one. Then moving to the front view, I'm going to select my TL leaf as well as its controllers. I'm going to switch the gizmo back to global. And I'm going to bring this second version of my Acanthus leaf all the way up according to my reference. Then it is just a matter of playing around with all the tools that we have. I'm using the lattice modifier to redefine the shape of my leaf, trying at the same time to keep proportions as stable as possible. In order to do so, I am of course also leveraging on the pivot point for our simple deform and on the value of the simple deform modifier itself. Again, take all the time you need to get it right. The non-destructive system that we built is flexible enough, and with a bit of patience it will get us to the desired result. Once done, in order to build the ring, we just need to repeat the same steps that we use for the short leaf. So I'm going to select my tall leaf and make sure that the scale is applied. Then I'm going to move the cursor right here, so Shift S and cursor to selected, and then I'm going to add a plane, scale it down a bit, and I'm going to move this plane into the TL_ring collection, select my TL leaf, Control click the plane, Control P, and make parent. And I'm going to rename this as TL_plane. As before, I'm going to expand this and I'm going to deselect DTL so that it is not visible. And the reason why is that we are going to use instances instead. And I'm going to deselect the visibility of the plane in both the viewport and the render. I will now add an empty right at the origin point of both the Acanthus leaf and the plane, and this will be our TL_rotation, and I'm going to put it within the TL controllers, and I'm going to enable them back just for now. And we can now select the plane, and again we will need to have an array modifier with 8 instances, and we can deselect relative offset, select object offset instead, and select our TL rotation. I will then bring the 3D cursor back at the origin of the 3D world by pressing Shift and C. And lastly, I will select my TL rotation and change the pivot point back to the 3D cursor and start rotating on the Z axis. And also in this case, we will need a 45 degrees rotation. So I'm going to type 45 and enter. To complete this part, I'm going to deselect the TL ring subcollection and the controllers as well. And in fact, we can deselect the whole instances collection. I'm then going to right click on the TL ring subcollection and instance to scene. And I'm going to move this within my Corinthian column collection. With the rings in place, we can move on to this other piece, which is called Caules. And I really didn't do anything fancy about it. Within a new subcollection in the instances collection, I just created a small replica of my main column using the same principles, but with a twist. Like there is literally a simple deform modifier with the twist option enabled on the z-axis, and I'll use this to give my mesh this kind of appearance. This very same technique can be used to create apparently complex structures. Provided that you have enough horizontal geometry, you will just need a subdivision modifier and a simple deform modifier set on twist on the z-axis. You can then experiment by selecting face loops and playing around with the extrude and inset operations. And this is the technique I would use in order to model some Gothic columns you may see in different cathedrals, but this is of course for another story. Back to our Corinthian column, I'm going to bring back the pieces that we have, select my new mesh, and I'm going to push it slightly on the x-axis, and I'm going to switch the pivot point to the 3D cursor and rotate the mesh on the z-axis by minus 22.5 degrees. If you noticed, I did all of my transformations in object mode, and in fact, if you hover over to the item sat panel, you would see that the location, but in particular the rotation, are not zero. This is usually not something you want to have, and you might have heard that you need to do all of your transformations in edit mode, but actually there are situations in which this kind of setup is pretty useful. In fact, let me switch this back to median, and you can now see that apart from the global space, I can access also the local space of my mesh, which will be slightly different, and in particular, it will be coherent with this kind of rotation that we have on the z-axis. And this is extremely useful when trying to position the mesh the way I want, since I can access this local x-axis to push it toward the inner piece and the rings of leaves, and I can also have access to this local y-axis, where I can rotate it according to its overall rotation on the z-axis. With this concept in mind, I positioned the mesh right where I wanted, and I also took care of some of the other elements of the column in order to make everything look good together. In particular, I took the lattice of the second ring of leaves, and I just pushed the extremities a little bit more on the x-axis. To complete the composition, and since I do not want to apply any of these rotations, I added a mirror modifier, and I used as a target the column, which has its origin point right at the center of the 3D world. Now we can simply deselect the subcollection, then again right-click and instance to scene. Move this into the main collection, and I'm going to deselect this instances collection altogether. And now what we can do is, if we switch this to the 3D cursor, we can simply Shift D to duplicate, and then we can rotate on the Z-axis by 90 degrees. And then we can Shift D again and rotate another 90 degrees, and then one last time. To model the volutes, I'm going to bring back one of my frontal references, and I'm going to move it so that the central point of the volute that you see on the reference is roughly aligned with the 3D cursor. Now under Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, if you look for Extra, you should find the built-in Add Curve Extra objects, and this will allow you to add a logarithmic spiral under Curve, Curve Spirals, Logarithmic. Let's now rotate it by 90 degrees on the y-axis, increase the number of turns to 2, and now we can play along with the radius and expansion force in order to make it match the reference approximately. So I'm going for a radius of 0.08, and then I'm increasing the expansion force, and something like this should be fine. I will then select with C some of the redundant vertices, and then X and delete vertices, and then I'm going to select the last one, and I'm going to extrude along the line of the reference. I will then tab out of edit mode and apply all transforms, and under the object properties, under geometry, I can play with the extrusion value in order to give it a bit of thickness. With the base structure in place, I'm going to make some minor adjustment. So I'm going to switch this back to global and this to median, and I'm going to enable proportional editing, select this last vertex, and with Alt S, I'm going to make it a bit thicker than the rest. And also I'm going to adjust some other points in order to make this look as smooth as possible. Once done, I'm going to select it and convert it to a mesh. Let's check the normals and everything is fine. Lastly, I'm going to Shift A and add a circle. The number of vertices should be the same as the number of steps that we used when building the logarithmic spiral, which is 24 by default. And I will then rotate the circle by 90 degrees on the y-axis and scale it down. I'm going to fill it with a face and I'm going to inset a bit. And I'm going to scale it to the point where these two vertices are basically touching, since I want this circle to be the ideal continuation of the spiral. Let's check the normals also for the circle, and we need to flip them, so I'm going to press Alt-N and flip. And now we can select both meshes and Ctrl-J to join. We need to join also the resulting geometry, and we have these two vertices here which are basically overlapping, so I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to press M and merge them at center. And another natural spot is right here with these two vertices, so I'm going to select this one, and then I'm going to merge this time at last. For the rest of the geometry, I want this line to survive and to eventually collapse right into this big circle. And to do so, I'm going to operate in this way. So we have some floating vertices. I'm going to select this section here, subdivide, take the resulting vertex, and I'm going to double press G to slide it into position, where its position is this ideal line right here. Then I'm going to select the floating vertex, this one we just created, and press M and merge at last. I then repeated the same steps by merging the vertices originally belonging to the circle to those belonging originally to the spiral, and then subdividing the resulting sections and merging the floating vertices to the ones just created. And this is the final result that we have. I'm going to select this edge and I'm going to delete it. And we also need to delete these faces right here. So X and delete faces. I will then manually select these four vertices and create a new face, then this edge, and I will press F to populate this lower face loop. Lastly, I will hit K to enable the knife tool and I will start cutting until I collapse, like so. At this point, we can start connecting the vertices in order to create the outer face loop of the spiral. And then select this vertex here and extrude, and select these 4 points and create a face. And now we can simply start selecting progressively the vertices lying on this edge loop and press F and continue the loop. I will then add an edge loop and slide it down a bit, then select the corresponding face loop and deselect some of the faces I do not want. And then I can press X and delete faces to create this sort of gap. And then it is a matter of bringing back the reference and start adjusting the points in order to make it match as precisely as possible. Once obtained the desired final shape, I extruded the face loop that we created, and I also added a bit of grease to the bottom edge loop. I then proceeded to move things around, and finally to add a bit of thickness to the whole mesh. We can then move everything away from the center and use a mirror modifier to get the second piece in place. I then duplicated the mesh, since I'm going to use one for the corners and one for the front, and then it is just a matter of playing around with the concept of global versus local space in order to place them properly in the composition. In this case, I decided not to use instances as the mesh is not that heavy, and I used instead a mirror modifier on both the x and y axis with the column as the target. But of course, if you want to optimize this further, you can use the techniques we've seen before in order to use instances also in this case. For the spirals at the front, I at first closed the shape by leveraging upon the mirror modifier already in place. Then I added a new mirror modifier and I proceeded to repeat the same steps and use the same logic as before for a proper placement within our Corinthian column composition. With that in place, I focus back on the spirals at the corners to make them full manifold meshes. The idea here for each of these is to have them starting as separate pieces, merging together only at the very end. It is now time to modify the inner piece and to give it its inverted bell shape, as to make it follow along the curvature of all the different elements that we have added up to this point. To do so, I simply added an edge loop in the middle, scale it down, and beveled it a bit. Moving on to the additional leaves sprouting from the Caules, I created a new collection and called it gl_leaf. Then I took my short leaf, duplicated it, and I removed the original parent-child relationship with old p. And of course, also in this case, I want this to have its own controllers. So I created a new sub-collection and call it gl_controllers. And then once again, I borrowed the deform and lattice controllers from the SL leaf, and I duplicated them and moved them into the newly created sub-collection. I then renamed them, selected my GL mesh, and into its modifier stack, I relinked the simple deform and the lattice modifiers. At this point, you already know what is happening here. I'm basically using all the tools that we have implemented, once again, in order to modify the shape of the mesh according to the surrounding geometry. To create the second piece of this group of leaves, I duplicated the first one, and also in this case I created two new controllers, since I want to manipulate the two pieces independently. And then again, it is just a matter of selecting everything and moving everything in object mode into the right place, and then patiently playing around with the control points of the lattice modifier, the intensity of the simple deform modifier, and the positioning of its pivot point. All the necessary tools to reach the desired result are already there, so just take your time and enjoy the process. To complete the composition, I created a simple base for the column, and then to define how tall the shaft should be, I simply added an edge loop and duplicated it as a separate object. Since the edge loop that we extracted is essentially the diameter of the shaft, and since the Corinthian column is supposed to be 10 times its own diameter, I rotated it and placed it here at the top with an array modifier on it, and if we bring the number of iterations all the way up to 10, you can see that we can use this concept as a unit of measure to define the overall size of the whole column. Now, I won't bother you any further with how to add these little details that you see right here, but let me instead show you a couple of practical examples on how to effectively use this within a scene. So first of all, within the Corinthian column collection, I'm going to Shift A and add an empty, and I'm going to place it here right at the top, and I'm going to call it as underscore main controller, and then I'm going to select every piece and then Control left click the empty and Control P to establish the parent-child relationship. In this way, we can move all the pieces together, and I'm going to position them so that they are right on top of the floor. Now we can follow a couple of different paths. The first one would be to have like your main scene within this same file. So suppose in the main collection, I have my main scene, which consists in a plane with an array modifier on it. Now what we can do is right-click the Corinthian column and instance to scene. And now we can Control left-click the plane and again Control P. And then under Object, select On Faces and disable the plane in both the viewport and the render. These columns, which are instances of instances, are still connected to the original generators or controllers. And in fact, if I bring back, let's say, my short-lived controller, like the deform, and if I start moving it, you can see that these columns in the main scene are still affected, which means that we retain the possibility of manipulating everything in a non-destructive way. The second option would be to select this Corinthian column collection, right-click, and mark as asset. This means that we can access it through the asset browser. So all we need to do is under Edit, preferences, and file paths, we can add the folder where this file is stored and add to asset library, and remember to save preferences. Now with a new file opened, I'm going to delete everything and bring up the asset browser, and I'm going to select the file that contains my Corinthian column. As the method, I'm going to choose link, which means that whatever change I do in the original file is going to be reflected also in this file, and then I'm going to simply drag and drop into the scene. And that's it for this video. This was a challenging one, but I hope you enjoyed the content. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and see you next time.